So, April 2022 was, of course, the tour of US museum ships, or at least the first one, and after a rather long drive from Battleship Cove, we ended up on the state border between Philadelphia and New Jersey. And since we'd come down the I-95 instead of the 295, that meant our first port of call was this wonderful vessel, which I'm sure most of you recognise as USS Olympia. And as we walked around to find how you access the ship, I was gratified to notice the Bolivian Navy had sent a representative. But we made our way round, and on a rather wonderfully sunny day, as most of our days, to be fair, during the April tour were, we decided to go aboard. Now, before I start rolling the video that we recorded, please be aware, I don't know quite what it was about this particular area, the river, but there seemed to be an unusual amount of electromagnetic interference that we didn't encounter on any other museum ships. And as I was using a radio mic at the time, some parts of some of the video recordings have little bursts of static or very short silent sections. I apologise, I can't do anything about that. There is no audio in those sections. Fortunately, they are very brief and not very common. And, there was no way to tell at the time that this was happening because you play through the first 10-20 seconds of your recording and it sounds fine. And then once you get to editing, you discover that, a minute and two in, there's a short static burst. If anyone who lives in the area happens to know anything about extremely high electromagnetic activity along this section of the Philadelphia-New Jersey border, please let me know. Well, let's just say I'll be using a wired mic if I go back to this area. Nonetheless, let's climb aboard. So, on this fine day, we find ourselves aboard USS Olympia. Now, where am I, you might ask, because, there's not a lot of ship in the background. Well, this is the port wing of the bridge, and right below and behind there's one of the larger casement-mounted guns. This is about the highest point on the ship that you can get without climbing ladders to fighting tops of funnels and that kind of thing. Searchlight position just forward. There is, of course, the wheelhouse just behind, where you would steer the ship, and it's the highest sheltered position in the entire ship. We are, of course, here on the east side of Philadelphia, where she is moored currently. There's another couple of casement-mounted weapons just beneath us here. You can see a much larger we'll go down and have a look at a bit later. And other smaller weapon just above it. US obviously going in for its stacked weapons already. But you can probably see from here, and maybe if not, you'll see when we get down there as well, that's not a casement weapon, the top one, because it is an open mount. One of the defining features of a casement is that it is fully enclosed to at least theoretically provide some protection. Now, if we look forward, you can see one half of the business end of the ship. So obviously this is the bow, and that is a pair of 8-inch guns. Normally, you'd find a pair of 8-inch guns, or indeed, obviously, because that's the bow turret, you've got the aft turret as well, so you have 4 8-inch guns. This kind of armament would normally be associated with an armoured cruiser in the time period that Olympia is built, which is the 1890s. Now, the thing about Olympia is that she's built in an era when the US Navy is trying to get up to any appreciable size after about 2 decades of cuts following the American Civil War. So they can't afford to build massive numbers of ships, but what they are looking for is, initially at least, a navy following the jeune école pattern, i.e. it's a few years before their idea for the massive battle fleet that doesn't quite come off either, but they're really looking into commerce raiding. And so Olympia, despite being a protected cruiser, has an armament that's on a par with some of the better armoured cruisers, which are kind of the next step up. Although not quite, her armament is within shouting distance of some of the smaller battleships. So USS Maine, under construction around about the same time as Olympia, is kind of maybe a second-class battleship. Most people rate her as an armament. She has 2 pairs of 10-inch guns, so not that much bigger than Olympia's. And of course Texas, which most people classify as America's first attempt at a battleship. That's the 19th century Texas, not the Dreadnought that's currently down in the namesake state. That had 2 12-inch guns, so 4 8-inch guns, 2 12-inch guns, and then of course you have to remember at the same time the Germans are building pre-dreadnought battleships that have 4 9.4-inch guns. So, as I said, Olympia's just the fraction below battleship level of armament, but definitely well within the punching power of an armoured cruiser, when she is in fact a protected cruiser, which is both smaller, and protected cruisers aren't just a size thing, because there are some really big protected cruisers. It's also to do with the way the ship is protected. Olympia and bow, which her main protection is a protected deck. And the reason that she has this very heavy armament, and the reason she looks a lot more modern than most protected cruisers of the 1890s, tend to have an awful lot of wing mounted plus 4.5 guns of roughly the same caliber. 4.5 guns, and admittedly she has wing mounted guns as well, but they tend to be a little bit larger and a little bit more numerous, is because she's designed as a commerce raider, following up on that Je ne Colle bit I mentioned earlier. Because the US Navy realizes in the 1890s there's no way they can take on a major opposing battle fleet and win, and so they plan to go after the enemy supply lines. The problem is obviously the enemy supply lines will be guarded by enemy cruisers, so if you send out a cruiser that has similar capabilities, excuse me, so if you send out a cruiser that has similar capabilities to the enemy cruisers, you might win, you might not, but even if you do win, unless it's very, very lucky engagement, chances are your cruiser will have to head home after that fight. Thing. Olympia is built to be significantly more powerful than almost any other protected cruiser of the time period, and certainly protected cruisers that are most likely to be put on merchant ship escort or convoy escort duty. So the idea is that she can come in, she can completely overwhelm any of the escorts, destroy the convoy or destroy the individual ship, depending on what she finds, and still have enough protection, enough firepower, enough endurance to be able to go on and repeat the process over and over again. Now, unfortunately, for those who like the design, which, to be fair, includes myself, right about the time that she's under construction, the US Navy changes its outlook and decides it is actually going to go in the end for something more closely resembling a conventional battle fleet. And so the cruisers, which was intended, is curtailed at just the one ship. So Olympia is the only one of her type. Subsequent cruisers that will be built after her built in slightly larger numbers, thus forming a decent fleet screen, whilst Olympia, kind of bereft of her originally intended commerce raiding mission, ends up mostly as a flagship for detachments of US Navy vessels elsewhere, which is of course what she does in the Spanish-American War, which we'll discuss a bit later. But before we head on down and have a look at some of the other parts of the ship, just have a quick pan across, and you can see just how crowded, even though this ship has no radar, minimal fire control capabilities, etc. when she's built. She has some searchlight platforms, but you can see she's got lots of intakes which supply the boiler rooms, which supply obviously the engine. Also, you can see all of these buff racks that are all over the ship. These are what are supporting the ship's boats, and you can see some of the davits and arms that would let them lower. So when she's cruising around, normally there'll be lots of boats over here. The deck will be a little bit more shaded, a bit more shaded, and obviously you can see the upper deck here also is the hull, which has been built up around it for the most part. The stern and the bow, not so much, but at least amidships you've got some splinter protection. Let's head on down. So just before we head on down, just another bit at the forward part of the bridge here. A few other bits to note. Obviously, here's our way of telling the engine room how fast we want to go. We have stop, we have back, 1/3, 2/3 full, ahead, 1/3, 2/3 standard, which is our standard speed forward, and then full, which is pull out all the stops. Obviously, this and this have kind of parted company a little bit. Hang on a minute. Nope. Okay, well, that'll need to be fixed at some point. So this is your engine indicator. There's another one over there, just in case, you know, whatever orders need to be given, you don't have to run across the bridge. And of course, we have the ship's compass, which is important, especially in this era, because bearing in mind the ship's compass dead reckoning, sextants, etc. That is still the only way of navigating the ship. There's no GPS, there's not even any radio navigation at the time that she's built. That would come in about 20 years later in a big way. But compass in there, sheltered from the elements, and of course these two, because the ship is made of steel, so this much ferrous metal near a magnetic compass, that's just going to go nuts. This makes sure that the compass is actually pointing in the right direction. And just in front of this kind of oblong thing, just aft of the forward turret, this is the ship's conning tower. Most of you probably know my feelings on conning towers already, but this one has at least some practical value, which we'll go down and see in a minute. And just in case you're wondering, before we head down, this is what the interior of that little sheltered steering position looks like. There's another compass there. But as you can tell, whilst it's good for keeping you safe from the weather, there's also another dial just there on the left, so you can give instructions to the engine room. Well, it is made of wood, so I wouldn't necessarily want to be in that position during a battle because, well, it's going to be splinter central, isn't it? So we've come down one level from the bridge. We're not actually on the upper deck. This is a deck that is basically built on top of the superstructure, but it contains... So, for example, we're now aft of the funnels. We're in a little bit of a sheltered area. Above us is a secondary flying deck. So, as with many US ships, there is a huge amount of redundancy built in. Obviously, if something happened forward, then you can still see a relatively decent distance from here. But this is a breech-loading 6-pound gun, one of the smallest guns on the ship. Says it's a Mark II and it's gun number 198, and compared to some of the other ships that you will have seen from the US tour, well, it's not exactly the world's most complicated weapon. There's no hydraulics, there's no power ramming, there's no shell hoists. It's literally gun. And well, this isn't really a tripod. What is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's a octopoded mounted pounder. Still has its breech there, the one just over on the starboard side doesn't. And this is really an anti-torpedo boat weapon. I mean, it looks big and scary, and indeed you really don't want to be on the other end of it. Torpedo boats, which at this time are sub 1,000 tons and, you know, covered with highly explosive torpedoes and have basically tin plate for armor, these, at least at this point, before they become torpedo boat destroyers and then destroyers, and in this case tertiary and later on in other ships secondary batteries have to upgrade. But for the moment, this is a perfectly good weapon. It's mounted high in the ship so that the gunners can ideally fire down on an incoming torpedo boat, which will do more damage. And as you can see, it's got this little opening, which is why this is a mount, not a casement, and this gives you your field of fire. So this is why there are multiple of these, and not only just to increase the chances of hitting something, because more shots, greater chances of a hit, especially in the era before rangefinders, fire control, plotting, etc., which you'll also notice there's no range-finding equipment here. There is literally an iron sight on the gun, and you would just have to play this back and forth. So at the moment, City Cruises, Spirit of Philadelphia, just coming past the gun's open mount. Right now it would be a warning shot, and now property damage is getting quite extensive. So as you can see, we can bear maybe 20-25 degrees forward of the ship's broadside, but there's considerably greater swing aft, to the point if you actually do get this thing aft, you're probably well over 50-55 degrees pointing aft. Now, this is a reasonable amount of metal. I mean, it's a bit more than splinter-proof. At long range, this stuff might stop a shell like this coming in. Not so much at close range. It'll definitely protect you from splinters and blasters as long as it doesn't come through this slot. But it will keep the crew a bit better safe than this if this was just a purely open mount. And since we're now at the end of this section, sitting on top of a portion of the superstructure, you can also see there, just through the side view, the sail of USS Bikuni, which is moored between Olympia and the shore. We're going to head down onto the first true full-length deck, right aft. Well, the rest of that outro piece is just a bit of screaming static, so probably best you don't hear it. Anyway, they also have these rather wonderful display models on the ship, so you can see the difference in colour scheme and layout of the ship as time goes on. So this is what Olympia looked like during her first commission. As you can see there, that ended in 1899. And then you move on to her appearance at the Battle of Manila Bay, where she's all in grey. Now, this doesn't mean that portrayals of US Navy ships in the Spanish-American War wearing the peacetime white colours are incorrect. It just means that at the time of the Battle of Manila Bay, this is what Olympia looks like, because the ships would be repainted into this wartime coloration around this time, at least in some navies, but maybe not necessarily all ships were able to do so before they ended up in a place where repainting was not possible. And then she reverts back into Great White Fleet style camouflage, or paint scheme really, for her second commission running through to 1906. And so you can see from what you've seen already and what you'll see elsewhere from other photos of the ship that she is currently on display in her second commission paint scheme. And then in the First World War, of course, she goes back to wartime coloration, and at this point she's had, amongst other things, her 8-inch guns replaced with long-barrel 5-inch guns, so this is effectively her final appearance before she goes out of commission entirely. And for those of you who were wondering, this is what the protected deck scheme for Olympia looks like. So you can see the flat part of the deck is essentially level with the waterline, maybe just a fraction above it, and it has these two much thicker sloping sides to the protected deck, below which is the engine room, the magazines, boilers, etc., etc. And of particular interest to those of you who may be more familiar with World War I and World War II ship design layouts, you can see the magazines here are right at the base of the ship, right up next to the hull, right next to the ocean, and of course in later eras the magazines would be moved much closer to the centerline of the ship and a little bit higher as protection against mines and underwater explosives such as torpedoes, which of course if they hit Olympia in this location would immediately set off the magazines. But given that Olympia is a 19th century vessel, although mines and torpedoes were around, they weren't as much of a design consideration factor at that point, and hence, with gunfire being the main thing they wanted to guard the magazines against, they were simply stuck as far down in the ship as was humanly possible. Now with all that said, back to the ship. So, aft main battery, this is supposed to be a pair of 8-inch 35 caliber guns, so again, for those of you you'll realise 35 caliber is a bit short for what we're usually thinking about 45, 50 caliber. But again, this is the late 18th century, so 35 caliber is pretty good for the time period. Guns 10, 15 years ago, or even shorter, 15, 20, 25 calibers. 20th century that you see most battleship guns pushing, and heavy guns on cruisers pushing past the 40 caliber limit. And for those of you who may not be aware what on earth I'm talking about, the caliber to a couple of things. So the actual caliber of the gun is an 8-inch gun. So this gap here is the width of the gun, or more precisely, this is the bore. This is 8 inches. And then if you measure the shell, you'll find it's 8 inches wide because it has to fit in there. And then expressed as 8-inch dash 35 or 8-inch 35 caliber basically means if you were to take 35 8-inch shells end on, usually base end on, and put them here and count 1, 2, 3, 4, and would get you to the back. Now the one thing you have to say about these guns is, hopefully you heard that because that hurt, these are not the originals, they're hollow. If this was the actual thing. And the reason that these are replicas, you can see they've been welded in because the turret is also a replica, and on the little spotting positions above, they've just kind of, again, had to paint in what should be a viewing slit, is because Olympia had a very long life in the US Navy. And during that time, she was refitted because 8-inch 35 caliber gun, not such a brilliant weapon by, let's say, the 1920s. And so over time, she was refitted, and removal of the one forward, and it was replaced with a pair of 4-inch guns. A little bit of a climb down in terms of overall firepower, but they're more modern guns, longer range. And then Those were subsequently replaced by a pair of 5-inch guns, which makes a little bit more sense because her secondary armament, which you can see here casemated, although nowadays with windows, is also 5-inch, so at least that's a uniform main battery. And then when she became a museum ship, she still had those twin 5-inch guns. The original 8-inch guns and turrets were long ago gone to the scrapyard. And so in order to restore her to the condition she was in during the Spanish-American War, they've had to construct these replicas. And so here they are now, back in her 1890s, 1900s appearance. This is the ship's wheel, or rather two of them, part of the same system. So this is one of the auxiliary control positions. Again, an element of redundancy built into the ship. You can also steer the ship from lower down, and we'll probably find one or two of those as we go. But as you can probably appreciate, being up right forward on the bridge, bit of an exposed position. If that gets blown up, or if there's enough fragments that have taken out the crew there, you can have a backup steering position here. Now, the reason obviously it's backup is, well, if I'm standing here, I can't see any. There's all sorts of intakes, bits of superstructure, more importantly, the aft funnel, kind of getting in the way of me knowing what on earth's going on. Now, if someone is up here on the flying bridge yelling down orders, perhaps that might work, but to be honest, most of the stuff that's in there, for me, is also in the way for them. It's not ideal, but we're sheltered behind these windows and being in the area of the aft 8-inch twin turret. So this is about the best hope for as a backup steering position, apart from obviously the bridge forward, before you have to go below decks. So that's what this is for, and the reason you've got two wheels is that, in harking back to the age of sail and ships of the line, up to ropes to manually steer the ship, i.e. direct physical connection from the wheel to the tiller, as opposed to mechanically assisted one, which is what you'd normally use, but you obviously might lose if the ship's taking hits and power is dying. Right, so we're now in the superstructure. So you can see just how compact this ship is compared to battleships and some of the later cruisers and such we've been on. The galley is in the middle of the space. There's tables and benches for the crew to eat, so both galley and mess. There's accommodation further aft for the admiral and for some of the other senior staff. And here, this is an ammunition area. So this particular isn't a refrigerator room, but you would also have ammunition stored around here. You've also got, there's an ice machine, because of course there is. But in all of this space, you're literally living right next to the guns. Now, this gun is not one of the originals that was present for the Spanish-American War, although it is a 5-inch gun. This is a more recent 5-inch 51 caliber gun, although on a ship this age you say more recent. This was fitted to the ship in the position of an original 5-inch gun in the middle of the First World War. So it's still a pretty old weapon. And in fact, if you look here, it says US Naval Gun Factory, 1915, so that's its date of manufacture, and it weighs 466 pounds. Or rather, I rather suspect some of the ammunition and charges weigh that, because I rather think this weighs a bit more than 446 pounds. Anyway, it also shows evidence of extensive modification. So over here we have the 5-inch gun sight. This is Mark 21 Mod 17, converted from Mark 21 Mod 6 in 1938, so just before the Second World War broke out. You can actually still move this around to a degree, but you can't move the gun itself because, understandably enough, they've locked that in position. Although all the teeth and everything still look pretty good. What you can do is open the breech. So we can demonstrate that now. Now this is obviously a huge, heavy chunk of metal, but I can move it one-handed quite easily because it's very well balanced. So this is a perfect close-up example of what's called an interrupted screw breech. So you'd open it up, shell and propellant, or one-piece ammunition if you've got it, depending on obviously the type of gun, because 5-inch, 6-inch guns, sometimes they'll have two-piece ammunition, sometimes they'll have one-piece ammunition, but whatever. The explodey stuff goes in there, and then this goes back, and as you can see, just by going in, it's already moving itself to close. You close it, and and now the gun is ready to fire, which we can't do for obvious reasons. But you can also see why it's called interrupted screw, because you've got these screw threads, but they exist only on these flanges. So I'll open it back up again so you can see. So you've got a couple of screw threads here, a couple of screw threads here, and corresponding bits in the gun, and that screws shut, and that forms an airtight breech. The gun is now ready to go. So this is part of Olympia's secondary battery, and would remain so throughout her career, even when obviously they are different 5-inch guns. So this is one of the original type of guns, the original 5-inch guns that Olympia would have had as a secondary. So we've seen the 5-inch 51. That's a considerably larger weapon. This is a 5-inch 40. So if you're following along, it's 11 calibers shorter. And given that it's a 5-inch gun, that means it's 55 inches shorter. But you can also see it's just physically a less imposing weapon. The 5-inch 51's kind of up to here. This one's down here. It's got a much simpler sight system. A nice little telescope you can look through there and there. Some simple brass plating there, and also has this nifty little stand and another one on the other side, which means that as the gun moves, so here is where you rotate it, you can rotate the gun and the gun will take you with it. You can see the various firing options here out the side, and a much smaller, although still interrupted screw breech system. So according to this says Ordnance Department. This is gun number 79, and it weighs 7,208 pounds. That much I do believe, a lot more than the other one claiming it's only 446. And it's a 5-inch mount, Mark 8, number 89, and it was installed in 1889. So again, original gun on the ship.
Now, before we descend any lower, let's check out the machine shop on board the ship, such as it is. So these are the various tools that they had to make repairs, create spares, and so on and so forth. But one of the things that you'll notice on the top right of this picture, as compared to the machine shops on the various more modern US museum ships that we've seen on the tour so far, or indeed on HMS Belfast, is that obviously being a late 19th century installation, this does not have any kind of electrical motor driving it. Instead, it has these big belts, and those belts would, in real life, once the ship was in active service, connect to this overhead shaft, and then that shaft would be driven from part of the ship's power plant elsewhere. So this is fan belt driving systems, which were very, very common in the 19th century. And something I'm sure you'll be very happy to know is that now, as we head further below decks, there was enough of Olympia's bulk to obscure whatever electromagnetic signals there were on the river that were causing all the issues with static and gaps in the recording thus far. And so from here on out, the audio is nice and crisp and clear.
Right, we find ourselves in the depths of the ship. This is one of the boiler rooms, and believe it or not, what you can see behind me is one boiler. So you might think, hang on a minute, you know, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, great, surely that's 4 boilers. No. There's one big cylinder, mostly hiding behind this stuff, and these are 4 furnaces, all supplying one boiler, and then there will be multiple boiler rooms. Now, over here, this WT door number 27, watertight door 27, this slightly predates, you know, having X, Y, and Z, all, or I suppose if you're American, X, Y, and Z, all over various doors. So this is just a named wireless door. There's watertight door, not wireless door. And this goes through to a corresponding boiler room, just on the port side over there. And there's a very narrow passage between the two, which obviously I can't show you because the camera won't follow me just yet. So if you want to go through there, I guess you could do, if you like being between 2 massive boilers full of piping hot water and steam and coal fires and everything, but personally I'd rather not. And then as you come across, so each of these grates would have to be opened to allow coal to be shoveled in. Okay, and over here, this is where the coal all comes from. So you could, I guess, shovel it all if you wanted to, one off, but apparently there is a procedure for coal shoveling. So the coal's over in here, in the depth of the coal bunkers. Some poor sod gets to stand in the coal bunker. I don't want to think what his lungs looked like after a few years in service, but he gets to shovel coal out of there, which will land somewhere here. And then somebody will be standing here, hopefully with good shin protection, getting pelted with bits of coal. They will pick up the coal and they will shove it over to here, and it will land around here. And then there'll be two guys who will then pick up the coal that's been shoveled to them and straight into the various furnaces it will go. And in case you're wondering what the numbers mean, well, 1, 3, 2 and 4, fairly self-explanatory. Those are the furnaces for this particular boiler. But then you also have a much bigger number 5 up there. Don't worry, there's not a mysterious great number 5 hiding behind an armoured panel that you'd need to be Kobe Bryant to actually manage. That is because this is the 5th boiler room. So there are at least 5 others, and of course because these machinery spaces are not uneven, there will be at least a 6th as well. A map appearing on the screen at the moment to show you exactly where they all are. So once you've turned coal into heat, and the heat's gone into the water and the water has turned into the steam, what happens to the steam? Because this isn't a jet boat, you're not venting huge amounts of superheated steam aft to make yourself go forward. It has to be used in another fashion. Let's go that way and find out. Let's go. And no, as you can tell from the fact I'm speaking, we're not reversing footage. I am actually walking backwards, which I'll probably regret at some point in the very near future when I walk into something big and heavy. Now, we're in an engine room, and unlike every other engine room you'll have seen on this tour, this isn't turbines. This isn't geared turbines. This isn't even direct drive turbines. These are the good old vertical triple expansion engines. So if you want to experience what a sauna full of engine grease is like, well, time travel 120 years back to when these things were working, because they're not going to be running them these days. But you can see it's a much more steampunk experience than the engine rooms of the more modern ships. So you have these massive great pistons, well, the business end of one, pistons are above, and then obviously you can see the cam rotates around here. Lots of lubricant needed to keep this from grinding to a screaming halt. And this continues. So you've got 1, 2, 3 big ones. And there's a little piston rod just there. So each of these 3 will have a different pressure of steam, hence vertical triple expansion. And as you can see, they've all been set in different positions. That isn't just for artistic purposes. This is actually the way that they would be configured, because it means that at any given time, at least one of them is pushing power into the shaft. If they were all aligned in a nice neat line, then there'd all be a big surge down, but there would also therefore be periods where there's not particularly any force being exerted. And they all connect to a propeller shaft, which runs down there to the aft of the ship, going out the back there. And as you can see from what we've got here on the table, for engines of this size, you also need equally outsized tools, various forms of wrenches, mostly. And there's a small auxiliary plant here. Plenty of nice levers, gears, and of course a sound tube so you can hear what's being said above you, because of course again no electrical communications when she's originally built. This allows you to open or shut the steam flow, as is indicated here, open and shut. Nice big wheel to turn, got quite a bit of heft to it as well. And despite the fact that this is an older technology than turbine engines, it's no less complicated. So you can see here, these are just some of the levers that would have to be used in operation. So we've got left port cylinder drain, intermediate port cylinder drain, intermediate pressure, no, so low pressure, intermediate pressure, high pressure. So this is all the 3 different cylinders, the different stages, hence vertical triple expansion. Low pressure receiver, intermediate pressure, high pressure receiver drain. So this is all to get rid of water and other things that might accumulate, because of course, as far as engines are concerned, water is incompressible. You don't want that building up. You want steam in these things. You do not want liquid water. And now you have the reversing engine, low pressure startup, intermediate pressure startup, high pressure startup, currently all set in the shut position, which is stop. Then you've got settings going down and settings going up for ahead and reverse. And how do you know what you're going to set them to? Well, you remember all the way back up on the bridge, we saw a couple of small versions of this, and this would be communicated down here, and this is how the engine room knows where they're supposed to go. Again, this has been disconnected, but apparently yeah, this is why you don't try and manually do the thing. There's a fair bit of spring pressure on there, but you know, it might sound a little bit unnecessary now, but when you've got this entire engine, possibly the secondary power plant going as well, bits of steam and lubricant flying around, people shouting, the sound of people walking around on metal decking going on, this dial nice and smoothly moving into position, not really going to tell much of anything. People are going to probably miss it. Whereas if they hear a that'll probably alert them to the fact that something's gone on. Also have a few more pressure gauges and such showing, and the single biggest friend of an engineer in a vertical triple expansion engine room, lubricant applicator. Because the last thing you want to hear is the squealing of metal on metal as one of these things eats itself. But in the event that something does seize up and tries to eat itself, you have the I wasn't asking physical impact mechanical stress routine tool, otherwise known as the big wrench. So this, again, is another piece of machinery you won't see outside of Olympia on this tour, and that's because this piece of machinery is completely unnecessary on an oil-fired ship. On an oil-fired ship, everything that builds up in the form of residue is either in the boiler, which is not really a good place for it to be, or mostly it hopefully gets exhausted out of the funnel, which is not particularly great for anything that happens to be in the immediate vicinity, but it's good for the ship. But on a coal-powered vessel, there is a problem. Coal does not burn cleanly, in the sense of coal does not burn cleanly, at least in the same way that oil, relatively speaking, does. Coal leaves a huge amount of physical residue behind. Now, if you have really good quality anthracite coal, less. If you're the German Navy and you're stuck with barely compressed peat, then a little bit more, considerably more in fact. But regardless, you're still going to have hot ash waste from burning the coal, and you can't leave that in the boilers, you can't leave that in the furnaces, you can't leave that down below, otherwise you're just going to end up waist deep in ash, which means that, considering it will have come straight out of a furnace, you will gradually be parboiling yourself, which apparently is not good for long-term health. So they would have to shove it all into buckets, but then who gets to haul hundreds and hundreds of pounds of ash in buckets up out of the ship? Well, they had thought of that. That's what this thing is for. So down in the boiler room below there was an ash hoist, and this is the opposite end of the ash hoist. Obviously there'll be chains, cables, ropes, depending on the time period attached to these, and this little bit of kit would allow you to haul up a big bucket of ash up to 300 pounds weight, which would get to here, and then it's still a fairly thankless task to get rid of it, but it's at least now above the waterline, so few people can quite easily pick it up, cart it out over the side, and off it goes. So we are now about 2/3 the way back on the ship, and we have some of the officers' country. So as you can see, it's fairly well appointed. Nice tables, officers' wardroom, panelling, helps them forget perhaps for a moment that they're on a warship on the high seas. In the event of action, all of this would go away. All of this paneling is in fact removable, and you can probably see just above it the actual steel bulkheads. And the reason it's removable is because, well, one, if a shell arrives aboard somewhere here, it is fantastic shrapnel opportunity, and that's at the best of times. The worst of times, of course, it's wood, which means it might not just turn into splinters, it might also turn into fire. And a fire hazard is not a good thing anywhere on the ship. But again, another idea of just how compact the Olympia is. There's a 6-pounder gun here just on the port side, and then over on the starboard side there's another 6-pounder rapid fire gun. So these 6-pounders are all over the ship. We saw some right up top behind the little armoured shield. These ones are more properly what you would call casemated, because they are fully enclosed and there is a bit of more protection as well. And just above us there's a skylight, so that goes further up, lets in a natural light, because although electric lighting was available for ships in this time period, it's not reliable. Bulbs blow, and of course you can't just pop down to the local shop for replacements, and they are also of somewhat limited capacity. If you have the direct sun coming straight down through there onto your dinner, you're going to be able to see things a lot better than you would with just the available squirrel cage light bulbs. And that, ladies and gentlemen, wraps up our little partial tour of USS Olympia. Again, I apologise for the audio issues in the first half of the video, but I have no idea what either the New Jersey State Authority or the Philadelphia State Authority is doing, blasting large amounts of EM radiation down the river, but they are, and precious little I can do about that. Nonetheless, absolutely huge thanks to the crew of USS Olympia, who of course let me onto the ship, let me film, let me down into those lower areas like the engine room, the boiler room, etc., and generally were just incredibly helpful in pointing out where the best ways to go were, and at one point, when I got slightly turned around, pointed out which way was indeed the way up and out. Now, what you might have spotted in some of these exterior shots, and you can see on the right in this picture, is of course the bow of USS Bakuna, which is Olympia's companion along the waterfront of Philadelphia, and that is also an excellent, well, boat rather than ship to visit. Unfortunately, didn't have the time to do a complete tour. We were shown around the Bakuna, but by that point the camera's batteries were dying, and, well, I just didn't have the time to create a video about Bakuna herself, at least this time around. Who knows, next time around, maybe I'll be doing that as well. So, of course, as I said before, it's a partial tour because I don't want to make it so that you don't have to go to Olympia to see what all over the ship. So I do highly encourage you, if you can, to go and have a look around Olympia yourself. And if you are unable to do that and you've enjoyed this video, then please do consider popping over to USS Olympia's page, which will be linked in the video description below, and support them in some way, shape or form. They have a quite nice little gift shop associated with them, and I'm sure they'd appreciate any help that anyone can give them, especially considering that this is one of the oldest steel warships still afloat, and they've been working extremely hard to ensure that she stays that way. And of course, what was the next ship on the journey? Well, it's just over the river, over there in New Jersey. It is, in fact, USS New Jersey, so spoiler alert, which ship we're going to be looking at as part of the continuing series from the US tour next month. Have fun until then.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.